In 1940, as World War II was entering its most horrifying phases, a rumor spread. Pilots who faced it called it a ghost in the sky, cutting through their squadrons with terrifying precision. The world didn't believe it could exist until it appeared over China and later at Pearl Harbor, changing the Pacific War forever. This was the A6M Zero, a masterpiece of engineering in the hands of elite pilots. But every legend has a breaking point, and the Zero's story would move from winning to desperation in just a few short years. From the moment this plane first took to the skies, it was a carefully crafted weapon built to capture and dominate wherever it went. Its story begins with Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer, who in 1937 was tasked by the Imperial Japanese Navy to create a fighter that could fly long distances, escort bombers, and outmaneuver any opponent. Japan needed a plane capable of striking faraway targets in China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and Horikoshi's team focused on two key goals: extreme flexibility and extended range. To achieve this, they made the Zero as light as possible. Every detail mattered. Parts were drilled with lightning holes, plywood was used in places to reduce weight, and a strong but lightweight extra super duralumin alloy was used to reinforce critical sections, such as the wing spars. Even the way the wings and tail were attached to the fuselage was carefully engineered to save weight. As a result, the Zero weighed nearly 1,900 pounds less than its primary opponent, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, giving it a massive advantage in speed and maneuverability. The plane's engine was placed close to the cockpit, creating an ideal balance between the center of gravity and the lift of the wings. This meant the Zero could turn and loop with incredible precision. Its large wings and low wing loading allowed pilots to make quick, sharp maneuvers that American fighters often couldn't match. In the early years of the war, the combination of a skilled pilot and the Zero's lightweight design made it almost untouchable. However, these design choices came at a cost. To save weight, the Zero lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and other protective features. While this made it deadly in the beginning, as American tactics improved and pilots learned to exploit its weaknesses, the Zero became more vulnerable. Still, the careful balance of aerodynamics, structure, and propulsion in its design meant that for a time, the Zero was the perfect embodiment of Japanese naval air power. The Zero's incredible performance in combat was matched by the elite skill of the pilots who flew it. Japanese naval aviation placed extreme emphasis on quality over quantity. Becoming a Zero pilot was no easy feat. Candidates went through a brutal selection process that tested endurance, precision, and instinct. Only a tiny fraction of applicants made it through the program, producing a small but exceptionally skilled cadre of aviators. These pilots were trained not just to fly, but to master the art of dogfighting, using the Zero's agility to its fullest. Training focused on exploiting the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Pilots learned advanced maneuvers such as the looping left twist, a technique designed to turn the plane at its slowest, most maneuverable point in a loop. Precision was essential. Any misstep could stall the plane and leave the pilot vulnerable. The Zero's large wings and lightweight frame made these daring maneuvers possible, giving Japanese pilots an unmatched edge in early aerial battles. Tactics were as important as raw flying skill. Japanese doctrine emphasized initiative in combat, which is why Zero pilots were trained to strike first and seize the first advantage. Once airborne, pilots were expected to constantly read the battlefield, maintain situational awareness, and coordinate attacks with other aircraft. Flying in formation and supporting wingmen allowed the Japanese to concentrate their firepower on isolated enemy fighters while minimizing their own losses. The results of this rigorous training were immediately visible. The P-40 Warhawk, and even the British Spitfire and Hurricane. Allied pilots, trained to fight German and Italian aircraft in Europe, were often unprepared for the Zero's nimble acrobatics and aggressive tactics. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai recalled that the combination of the Zero's design and the pilot's skill created a machine capable of an almost too good to be true dominance in the air. Ultimately, the Zero's reputation was as much about its pilots as its engineering, and these pilots were yet to learn a lot about the real world soon. It goes without saying that the Mitsubishi Zero quickly earned a fearsome reputation, proving itself in the first clashes of the Pacific War. Its combat history began even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, during Japan's operations in China, where the Allies initially dismissed reports of its effectiveness. But on December 7, 1941, the Zero made a dramatic debut in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese carriers launched waves of fighters and bombers, aiming to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, secure dominance in the region, and discourage American involvement in Asia. Despite a few U.S. fighters managing to take off, for example, the P-40 Warhawks, P-36 Hawks, and a handful of Wildcats, the Zero's maneuverability and the skill of its pilots proved overwhelming. Pilots like George Welch and Kenneth Taylor fought valiantly, shooting down several Japanese planes, but they were heavily outnumbered. On paper, some American aircraft were faster at top speed than the Zero, but in actual combat, they simply couldn't match its flexible nature. The combination of lightweight design, long range, and acrobatic ability allowed the Zero to outmaneuver any opposition, giving Japanese pilots a substantial tactical advantage. The Zero continued to dominate the skies in the months that followed. During the Indian Ocean raid in April 1942, Japanese carriers struck British bases in present-day Sri Lanka. Even though the main British fleet escaped, the attacks inflicted significant losses, and the Zero once again demonstrated superiority. Zeros clashed repeatedly with Allied aircraft such as the Hawker Hurricane, consistently outturning them in dogfights. Allied pilots quickly learned to fear the fighter, which seemed almost untouchable in these early months. From Pearl Harbor through the campaigns across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Zero was the centerpiece of Japanese naval air power. However, this dominance wasn't destined to last. By mid to late 1942, during campaigns like Guadalcanal, American pilots began developing new tactics to counter the Zero's strengths. Even older fighters like the F-4F Wildcat could hold their ground when flown with careful discipline. The myth of the invincible Zero began to fade as Allied forces adapted. Yet by that point, the Zero had already established itself as one of the most successful naval fighters in history. Its early victories left hundreds of Allied planes destroyed and showcased a perfect synergy of pilot skill and aircraft design. For a moment in 1941-42, the skies truly belonged to the Zero. The War Prize. Regardless of how untouchable it looked, the first Japanese Zero fighter captured by the Allies came months before Pearl Harbor, on November 26, 1941, in China. Two Japanese pilots flying Zeros from Tainan Air Base in Taiwan to Saigon became separated from their formation in dense fog. Their radios had been removed to extend range, leaving them unable to communicate. Low on fuel and disoriented, the pilots finally spotted a beach near the town of Qianshan on the Leichu Peninsula. One pilot, PO-1C Shimezo Inoue, landed successfully in his Zero, serial number 3372, while the other, PO-2C Takaaki Shimohigashi, crashed his plane, damaging it beyond repair. Local villagers quickly discovered the two flyers. They led the pilots to a schoolhouse, where the men were captured. The fate of the pilots remains uncertain, but the surviving Zero, 3372, was carefully removed and transported inland by Chinese forces. The damaged second aircraft was destroyed to prevent it from falling back into Japanese hands. Over months, mechanics and engineers reassembled 03372 in Liuqiao. Missing fuselage panels were replaced with locally made substitutes, but the aircraft was restored to flying condition. By summer 1942, American forces learned of this remarkable prize. Major General Nathan F. Twining visited China and confirmed the Zero's capture to General Claire Chennault of the China Air Task Force. American engineers, including Gerhard Neumann and Staff Sergeant George Mackey, worked on the plane, making adjustments and installing American radio equipment. Colonel John R. Allison became the first American to fly the restored Zero, which now bore Chinese markings and the serial number P5016. 03372 was thoroughly tested by a small group of American aces known as the Zero Club, including Allison, Bruce Holloway, Grant Mahoney, Clinton Vincent, and Albert Baumler. Each pilot flew the aircraft to assess its capabilities, gaining crucial insights into the strengths and weaknesses of Japan's most feared fighter. In early 1943, 03372 was flown to Karachi, India, under American escort, and later shipped to the United States. It underwent repairs at Curtiss Aircraft before receiving final markings, EB-200, and underwent further test flights at Wright Field, Ohio, and Eglin Field, Florida. 03372, known as the China Zero or Tiger Zero, became a Central War prize. Its capture gave the Allies their first detailed look at the fighter that had dominated the Pacific skies, offering insights that would help counter the Zero in later battles. Every legend has its sunset, and the Mitsubishi A6M Zero was no exception. At the start of the war, it ruled the skies with unmatched power, lightning-fast turns, and pilots trained to perfection. But by 1943, the tide was turning. The Allies had learned from their early defeats, testing captured Zeros and discovering weaknesses in the plane's structure and engine. The P-51 Mustang, F-6F Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair arrived with superior speed, armor, and firepower, exploiting the Zero's vulnerabilities with hit-and-run tactics. No longer could Japanese pilots rely on skill alone. The first clues of the Zero's vulnerability came with crashes and captures. In February 1942, Hajime Toyoshima crash-landed on Melville Island, becoming the first Japanese pilot taken prisoner on Australian soil. Components of his aircraft were salvaged, giving the Allies their first taste of intelligence on the feared fighter. A few months later, the Akuten Zero crash landing during the Dutch harbor raid provided the Americans with an intact fighter to study. Once repaired, it revealed design weaknesses, stiff controls at higher speeds, and engine issues under extreme maneuvers. With this knowledge, Allied pilots could now challenge and outmaneuver what had once seemed invincible. Meanwhile, Japan faced another crisis: the decline of experienced pilots. Years of intense combat had thinned the ranks of veteran aces. To fill the gap, Japan turned to desperate measures, forming the kamikaze units. Young pilots, often with little training, were sent on suicide missions, guided more by honor than skill. The Zeros they flew were no longer weapons of precision, but missiles of desperation. Many never reached their targets, crashing into the sea, their potential wasted. Even top aces like Saburo Sakai criticized the policy, seeing it as a brutal misuse of Japan's remaining fighter talent. By 1944, the myth of the Zero had faded. New tactics, better aircraft, and the loss of pilots overshadowed its sleek design and lethal reputation. Yet, even in decline, the Zero left a mark on history, a symbol of Japanese ambition and the extraordinary skill of its pilots. It was a reminder that no matter how dominant, all machines, all strategies, and all heroes eventually face the limits of time and circumstance. The story of the Zero shows how skill, training, and clever design can make a plane and its pilots almost unstoppable. But even the best things can lose their edge. from its first victories to its later struggles. The Zero left a mark on history that won't be forgotten. If you enjoyed learning about this famous fighter, give this video a like, share it with friends who love history, and subscribe to see more amazing stories from World War II and beyond.